Inside Church, Pastor Aaron coming to you with another episode of our summer sermon series called Campfire Stories. And today I'd like to start our story with another story, just to get things going. In the year 1292, Scotland had no king. But there were several who wanted to wear the crown, and so in order to settle the dispute, the Scottish nobles asked the King of England, Edward I, to come help decide who had the strongest claim to the Scottish crown. The King Edward insisted that if he were to do this, the Scots had to accept his authority in that matter. Well, they reluctantly agreed, but no sooner had Edward chosen a king for Scotland than he asserted his own authority over Scotland, arrested their king along with hundreds of the Scottish nobles, and then installed English governors and garrisons of English soldiers throughout Scotland. In the face of such overwhelming force, most of the remaining Scottish nobles surrendered to English authority. But one young Scottish knight resisted. Some historians say that it was because one of the local English governors either kidnapped or murdered his wife, but regardless of the cause, this young Scottish knight, William Wallace, attacked the English garrison, murdered the English governor, and then began rallying the Scots to resist. And resist they did. Despite the reluctance of the Scottish nobles, the people were emboldened by William Wallace to form an army and fight back against the English. Ultimately, after winning a number of small skirmishes, their greatest victory came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which effectively pushed the English out of Scotland. Unfortunately, this victory only came about because King Edward had been busy fighting in France. But after he signed a truce with the French, he was able to focus his attention back on Scotland, and he responded with great fury, defeating William Wallace and his army, and then reinvading Scotland. In response to this pressure, the Scottish nobles once again surrendered, while William Wallace roamed the countryside trying to keep his shrinking army intact. Eventually, he was captured, he was tried, and he was executed in gruesome fashion in the year 1305, which seemed to be the end of Scottish resistance. But a curious thing happened. Within a year, the Scots crowned Robert the Bruce as their next king. And inspired by William Wallace and his martyrdom, he rallied the people to fight for their freedom. He waged war against the English for the next 7 years until he won a decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314, which ultimately led to the Scots winning their independence from the English in the year 1328. It's a fascinating story. I've really oversimplified it, but this is the story that was made popular by the wildly inaccurate Mel Gibson film Braveheart. But it does raise a question for us. Would you say that William Wallace was or was not a hero? Well, whether you think he was a hero or not, the Scots certainly considered him one, and he was immortalized by historians and bards for centuries after his death. I mean, this is how we like to remember our history. Good versus evil, heroes versus villains. It's how we tell our stories, or at least how we used to. Some of you may be old enough to remember some of the old Westerns on television. In those old Westerns, you could always tell the hero because he was the cowboy in the white hat. You could always tell the villain because he was the cowboy in the black hat. Everything was cut and dry, good and bad. But maybe it's because life is more complicated than that the more interesting stories have more complicated heroes. In fact, sometimes we're not even sure if they're heroes or not. It's why some people find Iron Man to be more interesting than Captain America. It's why Batman is far more interesting than Superman, why Mandalorians are far more interesting than Jedi. They're not necessarily good people, but we find them fighting for good causes. And so it is with Bible characters, Bible heroes. With the exception of Jesus and possibly Joseph and Daniel, every hero of the Bible is flawed. Some of them are flawed so badly that we're not entirely sure whether we're looking at a hero or a villain. And never is that more true than with the main character of our story for today. Because today's story is about Samson. Whether he's a hero or a villain seems to depend upon how the story is told, and I've heard the story told both ways. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to just tell the story the way the Bible does and let you decide for yourself. Our story begins in Judges chapter 13. This story actually encompasses 4 whole chapters, but in Judges chapter 13, verse 1, we begin with this statement. The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. Now, there's a lot packed into that verse, so let me try to explain. The book of Judges tells the same basic story at least 6 times. The people of Israel abandoned the Lord to worship other gods of the surrounding nations. So God allows the surrounding nations to conquer and enslave Israel. After a few decades of oppression, the Israelites turn back to God and they cry out for deliverance. And then God raises up a mighty warrior called a judge who defeats the enemy and then leads the people to return back to worshiping the Lord. Then when the judge dies, the people revert back to idolatry and the whole cycle begins again. Rebellion, judgment, repentance, deliverance. Our story, the story of Samson, is the last of these cycles to be recorded in the book of Judges before the trajectory begins to change. And so we read at the beginning of this story that the Philistines are now Israel's overlords. Now, one more thing before we get rolling, okay? I think it's important for us to understand something about the Philistines. I think it's important for us to know that when God handed the Israelites over to the Philistines didn't exactly defeat the Israelites so much as they infiltrated the Israelites and pushed them to the margins of their own land. It wasn't so much a military victory as it was a cultural victory. But once the Philistines had gained cultural and social power, they then used that power to oppress the Israelites, make them second-class citizens in their own land. For example, it got so bad that only Philistines were allowed to be blacksmiths so that the Israelites couldn't make swords for themselves. Israelites had to ask Philistine permission to go to the blacksmith just to sharpen their plow before farming season began. Now, that little dynamic there is actually going to be important going forward, the idea of where the culture lay. Now, back to our story, okay? There was a man by the name of Manoah living in Philistine-occupied territory, and he and his wife were unable to have children. But one day, the angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, I know that you cannot have children, but you're going to. You're going to conceive and you're going to give birth to a son. So I want you to be careful. Don't drink any wine, don't drink any beer, and don't eat anything that is ceremonially unclean. And when your son is born, never cut his hair, because the boy is going to be a Nazirite from his birth until his death, and he will begin to save Israel from the Philistines. Now, one comment. I'm not going to keep doing this, but one comment before we keep going. Nazirite. He's going to be a Nazirite. What is this? Well, it's an old Hebrew word. It just means dedicated or consecrated. When an Israelite wanted to dedicate or consecrate himself to the Lord for a particular purpose or a particular time, he would take a Nazirite vow, which would require him to abstain from alcohol, abstain from coming into contact with any dead bodies, which would render him ceremonially unclean. And he was also never supposed to cut his hair. That was part of the vow. Now, what's unique in this situation is that there would be no vow. Instead of the boy dedicating himself to God, God was dedicating this boy to himself in order to save Israel. Now, one other unique thing about this situation. Unlike all of the other judge cycles, God was raising up a deliverer, but the people had not asked to be delivered. That also will be important going forward. Well, the angel of the Lord said all this to Manoah's wife. You can imagine the woman's surprise, and so she ran to Manoah to tell him what had happened. He believed his wife, of course, and that night he prayed, "Dear Lord, would you send that man back?" I'm talking about the angel. "Would you send him back so that he can tell us how to raise this child?" Well, the Lord heard Manoah's prayer and answered, and sometime later, Manoah's wife was out working in the field by herself, and the angel appeared to her again. Quickly, she ran to get Manoah, and when he arrived, he asked, "Are you the same one that appeared to my wife before?" The angel said, "Yes, I am." He says, "Okay, when your words come true, what will the boy's responsibilities be? What's his work going to be? What's he going to do?" Now, the angel didn't answer that question. He just said, "Just make sure your wife does what I told her to do. No wine, no beer, don't eat anything ceremonially unclean." Wait just a second, Manoah said. Can I prepare a young goat for you? He was trying to be hospitable. And the angel said, "Well, you can prepare a meal, but I'm not going to eat anything that you prepare for me. But if you'd like to offer a sacrifice, offer it to the Lord." Now, little side note, whenever we run into the quote-unquote angel of the Lord in the Old Testament of our Bibles, a lot of times it's God himself taking a physical form. So just going to say that. But Manoah didn't know that at this point. So Manoah asks the Lord, he says, "Well, okay, but what is your name? We'd like to honor you when your words come true." But the angel replied, "Why do you ask my name? You wouldn't understand it even if I told it to you." So Manoah goes, he gets the goat, he gets some grain, he offers a burnt offering on the rock in front of the angel, and something amazing happens. As the offering is consumed in the flame, the angel ascends and disappears in the flame. And Manoah says instantly, "Oh no, we're going to die because we just saw God." His wife says, "Don't be silly. If he was going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted the offering, and he wouldn't have told us all that he did." And so she became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Samson. Now, the Bible says that the boy grew, the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began moving and directing in his life. Now, how much of this Samson knew or understood, I'm not sure. No doubt he knew that he had been chosen by God. His long hair was a constant reminder to him of that fact. And perhaps there's no reason to think that he wasn't aware of his destiny. We don't know that his mom and dad kept any of that secret from him. And so it's probably no surprise that knowing his destiny, knowing he had been chosen by God, probably no surprise that Samson, as he grew older, started spending more time in Philistine cities. What was surprising, however, was the fact that he fell in love with a Philistine woman and came home and asked or told his parents to arrange a marriage for him. Now, naturally, his parents were appalled. Marrying outside the faith was forbidden. But to be fair, most of the Israelite women at that time period were outside the faith too. Now, regardless, he insisted to his parents, "She's the right one for me." Now, it's at this point of the story that the narrator steps in, and he wants you to know something that Samson's parents didn't know. And that was that this whole arrangement was actually from the Lord, because God was seeking an opportunity to create a conflict between Israel and their Philistine overlords. So, one day, Samson is going down to the Philistine town of Timnah to see this girl, and as he's walking through the vineyards, taking a little shortcut, a lion pounces on him. Instantly, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and Samson actually rips the lion apart with his bare hands. And then he continues on down to Timnah and decides that this girl indeed is the right one for him. Later, when his father and mother accompanied him to Timnah to arrange the marriage, Samson took that same shortcut through the vineyard to kind of see if the lion's carcass was still there. Not only was it still there, but bees had built a hive in the carcass and honey was just flowing out of that lion's dead body. So Samson scooped some of the honey up, he ate it, and he actually gathered some of it and took it to his parents, gave it to them. They had some, but he didn't tell his parents where the honey came from because it involved touching a dead body, and that was forbidden to Nazarites, and you could probably see where that was going. Well, eventually, the marriage between Samson and this Timnite woman was arranged, and Samson prepared the wedding feast. Unfortunately, Samson didn't seem to have many friends of his own, so the Philistines found 30 young men to fill out the party. When things were just getting started, Samson said to the boys, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you can guess this riddle during the 7 days of the feast, I will buy each of you a suit of clothes. But if you don't get the riddle right, each of you owes me a suit of clothes." They said, "No problem. Give us the riddle." He said, "All right, here's my riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." Of course, you know the answer, don't you? He's talking about the lion and the honey. But of course, they didn't know that. So after 3 days of trying to figure it out, they found Samson's wife. And they told her that if she didn't get the answer to the riddle for them, they were going to burn her and her father to death. Naturally, she starts crying. Every time she sees Samson, she starts crying. And she's asking for the answer to the riddle. He's ignoring her. And she says, "Samson, you don't love me. If you loved me, you'd tell me the answer to the riddle." He says, "I haven't even told my parents the answer to the riddle. Why would I tell you?" Which is kind of a weird thing to say. But eventually, by the 7th day of the feast, she wore him out. And he finally told her the answer to the riddle. And of course, she went and she told the guys. And at the end of the feast, Samson said, "Hey, how about the riddle?" And they said, "Hey, we got the riddle. I mean, come on. What's stronger than a lion? What's sweeter than honey? We got this one. This is easy." Well, Samson knew what had happened, and so he had a new little poem for them. And he said, "Well, if you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle now." Again, not a very encouraging thing to say. But at that moment, he was so angry that the Spirit of the Lord actually came upon him, and he went a day's journey up the coast to the Philistine town of Ashkelon, killed 30 men, took their clothes, brought it back to Timnah, gave the 30 clothes, and went home to his father's house. With Samson gone, the bride's father, in order to avoid embarrassment, gave her away to the best man, which is something that Samson didn't find out until he came back to Timnah to see his wife. When the father told him that she'd been given to another man, Samson said, "Yeah, you know what? The men of Ashkelon, that was on me. What I'm about to do, this is on you." Samson goes out and he captures 300 foxes. Now, whether he set traps or ran them down, no idea. But he captured 300 foxes, and he would take 2 foxes, and he would take a burning torch, stick it between their 2 tails, and tie their 2 tails together and let them go. Now, you can imagine what 2 foxes with their tails tied together would do. They would go berserk, of course, especially if they have a burning torch between their tails. And he did that with 300 foxes and let them go in the fields of the Philistines. And the result was all of their standing grain was burned, all of their grain in storage was burned, all of their vineyards were burned, and all of their olive orchards were burned. Their entire agricultural and ecosystem was completely destroyed. When the Philistines found out what had happened, which probably didn't take too long, they asked, "Who did this?" And they said, "Well, that was Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite man." The Philistines were so angry that they took Samson's bride and her father and burned them to death. Now, when Samson found out that his wife had been murdered, he went